Welcome back, YouTube. And if you are new here, hi. My name is Noah. I'm a spiritualist, and on my channel, we talk about death, true crime, haunted people, places to think, spiritual reparations, and how you can fuck around and what? Find out. If you are not following me, I highly recommend that you do so now. If you're already here, good and comfy, turn your notification bells on, please. Before we start this episode, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to all the people that tuned into the live Bizarre Junkie call-in show last Friday. I truly appreciate it. I loved hearing all of your stories. We are trying to get on some kind of schedule where I come in regularly and you guys can call in and tell me your spooky fuck around and find out stories. But I do appreciate the people that were there last week, and I hope to see you guys soon on there. If you're not following Bizarre Junkies, I highly recommend. I am going to be linking them down in the description of this video. Their content is chef's kiss. Good people, good stories, always high vibrational. On today's episode, we will be covering a serial killer that I'm pretty sure a lot of you have never heard of before, because I hadn't heard of this woman, yes, I said woman, before a couple months ago. Her story has a lot of twists and turns and has put some doubt in a lot of people, but I wanted to share it with y'all so that y'all could give me y'all opinions, because I have my own opinion. And this supposed serial killer's name is Clementine Barnabet. Clementine's story has often been referred to as the Hoodoo Voodoo murders, depending, of course, on who you talk to. Clementine Barnabet was said to be born in St. Martinville, Louisiana, to Nina Porter and Raymond Barnabet, and this was around 1894. It's very unclear as to what year she was actually born, but they know it's somewhere in this time period. She had 3 brothers, one of them named Zephyrin, and their father was said to be a Rolling Stone and very abusive to the children and her mother. This story starts off in 1911 when Clementine was a teenage girl. Between 1911 and 1912, there were a lot of murders of Black families along the Southern Pacific Railroad, stretching from Texas to Louisiana. And all the families were murdered in the same way, with an axe. These families were murdered and hacked to bits and pieces, and it seemed like it was only African American families in this area. I mean, almost 12 families, if not more, were murdered, and no one knew who was committing all these horrific crimes. And this was very terrifying for African American families. They're fresh off of slavery. A lot of these families were very higher up in the African American communities, and they didn't know who was going to be next, because it wasn't like it was one spot that all of these people were being murdered in. This was across states, and they have worked so hard to get away from sharecropping, to get away from slavery and all this other stuff. They didn't know what was going to happen. Black people were terrified because they weren't just murdering the mama and the daddy. No, whoever was doing this was annihilating the whole lineage. The mama, the daddy, the babies, everybody in the house would be hacked into little itty bitty pieces. In 1909, the Barnabet family decided to move from St. Martinville to Lafayette, Louisiana. And like I said before, these murders started in 1911. So only a year and a half to 2 years after the Barnabet family moved from St. Martinville to Lafayette, it seems like a string of very gruesome murders were happening in this area. Whomever was doing this was sneaking in the homes in the middle of the night and fracturing the occupants' skulls with an axe. I mean, even newborn babies who couldn't even identify this person were being hacked to death. On February 11th, 1911, the Boussard family were found murdered in their home. And I felt like this was the beginning of people looking into the Barnabet family. The father, the mother, and the baby were murdered. And the police figured out there was a pattern. Whoever was doing this was using the family's axe, because back then an axe was like a kitchen knife. Everybody had one. And they realized that this murderer liked to come through back windows. So they were starting to piece together little by little the pattern of this serial killer. And then about 2 weeks later, another family in the area called the Anders were also murdered in a very similar fashion. It was a mother, a father, and two very small children. Now, we had the sheriff on the case, and he was collecting evidence. And this killer, whoever this was very sloppy. They would leave a bucket sometimes to drain the blood from the victims, write Bible verses on the wall in the victim's blood, and sometimes put wood in between the children's fingers to make it look just flush. These murders were weird, and it's nothing that the state of Louisiana had ever seen before. Additionally, in the Anders murder, the two children were positioned, almost propped up to look like they were praying. Whoever this was diabolical. Meanwhile, in Texas, on March 22nd, 1911, the Castaway family were found brutally murdered in the same way that the Louisiana families had been found. Like I said, this was a string of murders that they could not figure out who the hell was doing all this. The father's name was Alfred. The mother's name was Elizabeth, and their three children had been hacked to death. But something made this murder a little bit different than the others. See, the others that were murdered were all black families. This particular family was interracial. The father was black and the mother was white. And y'all know whenever a white woman back then was murdered, it was like a dog whistle. So authorities was on the killer's ass like white on rice. So then they started asking people in Lafayette some questions about who they thought was committing these strings of murders, and they all pointed to the Barnabets. Why would they think that they're doing this, right? When Lafayette authorities would ask about the Barnabets, it was always something negative that was said about them by the neighbors or whatever the case is. Remember, they had just moved there, so the neighbors had already acquainted with each other and made some sort of camaraderie with each other. They were the oddballs out. They said that the Barnabets were weird, that they were dirty, that they were miscreants, that they were low class trash. They pretty much put all the focus on the Barnabets because they were not like the average free black folks that were from Lafayette, that originally were from New Orleans, because they just didn't fit the description. They weren't from there. They were different. It also didn't help that Raymond Barnabet, the father, his common law wife, Nina Porter, which was Clementine's mother, has started telling people that she suspected Raymond was the killer. So not only are you having maybe a case of classism, you also have this man's common law wife running around town saying that Raymond may be responsible for all of these murders. So without proof, the town sheriff arrested Raymond Barnabet. All because someone said that they were dirty miscreants who didn't fit the prototype of the community that they had integrated themselves into. There wasn't enough evidence to keep or hold Raymond Barnabet, so the sheriff had to release him, only to rearrest him again for the murders of the Bizarre family and the Anders. Again, having no evidence against him or his family. So in October 1911, Raymond Barnabet went on trial and was indicted on the murders of the Anders and the Bussards. During the trial, his common law wife, Nina, and his two children, Clementine and Zephyrin, testified against their father, Raymond. His common law wife, Nina, said on the stand that Raymond had came home the night of one of the murders at about 2 a.m. But then Clementine went back and said no, he came in much later than that, covered in blood and brain matter. Then Clementine also said that he sat down and confessed of these murders. And her brother Zephyrin absolutely backed her on this. Raymond Barnabet was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The end, right? Wrong. That's not the end of this story. Because while Raymond Barnabet was in jail in November of 1911, Another family was massacred in the same exact way. The killer used the family's axe, snuck in a back window, and took no survivors. I mean, from the mom, the dad, the children, everybody died. The Randall family, mom, dad, and three small children, never had a chance. So, how could Raymond be responsible for this if he was behind bars at the time? The math is not mathing. This murder was a little different than the rest as well because the father was shot in the head prior to being cut up with the axe, which is usually not the killer's MO. Again, without any evidence, the sheriff arrested Clementine and her brother Zephyrin. The sheriff was more suspicious of Clementine than her brother because the sheriff recalled when he picked up Raymond Barnabet that Clementine had blood on her clothes. He also said when he searched Clementine's room, she had bloody clothes in her closet. Of course, Clementine denied any involvement in any of these murders. During their investigation of everything, they made the conclusion, the police department and investigators made the conclusion that these murders were spiritual and they suspected a group of people doing these murders. During the time that Clementine was in jail, two more black families were murdered in January of 1912. One of the murders done in January of 1912 was the Warners. Marie Warner and three children. She was a single parent, and they were murdered in the same exact way that the rest of them had been murdered. A couple days later, another family, husband, wife, and children, were massacred. Except this time, the murderer decided to write Psalms 9:12 in blood, in the victim's blood, on the wall. Like I said earlier, the children's palm was spread out like this, and they put splints in between each finger. And they also collected the blood in a bucket from each child from their head wound. It was absolutely out of control. And the message that was written on the wall, the Psalms, was from the blood that had drained into this bucket from the children's head wound. And then in April of 1912, another family was murdered. Now, they supposedly got their girl, but she's in jail right now while all of this is happening. On April 5th, 1912, Clementine Barnabet, who was 17 years old at the time, confessed. She claimed that her and her father Raymond were leaders of a Hoodoo cult called the Church of Sacrifice. There was three other members, and Clementine claimed that she would dress as a man and travel by train to commit these murders. She also claimed that she experienced sexual gratification while she was committing the murders and that she would molest the children's dead bodies. Clementine confessed to killing 17 people and said that the news actually got it wrong, that these killings started in 1909, not 1911 like they suspected, and that the murders took place in Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. A newspaper in Lafayette was reporting everything that Clementine said to investigators, and they were printing it out, and everybody had in their mind that this was the killer. But her story kept changing because a couple of days later, she said, oh no, it wasn't 17 people, it was 35 people. And that the reason why the church, the cult that she was a part of, did this is so they could live forever. They wanted immortality, and they believed that committing all these murders would get them just that. In August 1912, another family was nearly killed. They were attacked. The mother almost was killed, but she fought off her attackers. Clementine is in jail. In October 1912, at the tender age of 19 years old, Clementine Barnabet was sentenced to prison, life in prison. On July 31st in 1913, Clementine escaped jail. She did get out successfully, but they did catch her and brought her back to jail. And while in jail, supposedly, Clementine was given a procedure to make her a normal, functioning human being. And at the age of 29, she walked out of prison a free woman and disappeared into the abyss. Now, my opinion of this true crime story. I am not convinced that the Barnabets, whether it be Zephyrin or Clementine or even Raymond, committed these crimes. What I do believe is that they were victims of classism. Why don't you think I believe this? Simple. Have you guys ever seen American Horror Story Coven, where the Supreme falls in love with the spirit of the Axeman? Well, that said Axeman was actually real. And he was on a murdering spree from 1911 all the way up until 1919. And he was never caught. He was described as a middle-aged white man. He was terrorizing people from New Orleans and surrounding areas. Okay. I don't I don't believe that she did this. What I do believe is that the Axeman was killing people all down south, killing black people, because back then black people were looked at as less than human. And it was easier to get away with murdering black families than it was white families, because he eventually started killing them as well. But I feel like in the early part of this whole debacle between 1911 and 1918 or 1919, he was killing black families as well. I think that was the start. And then he got bold and started killing white families. Well, Noah, she confessed, and none of her confessions made sense. Not one. She was in jail for the time being. The Barnabets were underneath investigators' thumbs. They were watching them like hawks. These other 5 members were never found. And really, we need to have a deeper conversation about mental health back then. Because let's keep it real, ever since the beginning of time, especially back then, black people usually were the targets for very racist and outlandish accusations because it was easier to prosecute a black person. These trials were only a day or two long, and they were made up of an all-white jury. Going back to the sheriff that said he found bloody clothes in Clementine's closet, and when he went to arrest Raymond, she had blood all over her. If that was the case, sir, why didn't you arrest Clementine right then and there? Why did it take so long to arrest her? A lot of the times, even today, when people are under duress, they confess to things that they didn't necessarily do. But back then, that was very much so the case. And to prevent herself from being lynched, I feel like she made up this outlandish story about this cult and all this other stuff just to make sure that she lived to tell this story. And she actually did. There was a story that was released in 1985 about a woman who went to visit her great-grandmother who happened to be 103 years old. And her great-grandmother told her a story about Clementine Barnabet. She told her the story about how Clementine was a murderer and all these other things, right? So whenever the great grandmother passed away, her granddaughter went to go clear her items out of her house. And she found a picture of a young black woman who was her grandmother, and it was the picture that is commonly known as Clementine Barnabet today. So I'm not sure what I really believe. To me, I feel like they probably didn't do this. But, it is what it is. She's listed as a serial killer on Google. But I have researched so many cases, haunted spiritual reparations, fuck around and find out cases that involved this time period. Like a lot. So what I'm telling you is that the pattern of how the Barnabets were targeted, the matter of how the confession came out, none of it is adding up. The math is not mathing. I don't believe that they were responsible for this. But when you live to be 103 years old, you can tell anybody anything. Shit, I know I am. I feel like this was a case of classism and just like a pass the buck type of thing. I mean, for Pete's sake, the neighbors were calling them degenerates, dirty, nasty, filthy people. And what is the easiest way to make something go away? To blame the people that you don't think is worthy of being in your space. But what do y'all think? Do you think the Barnabets committed these murders? Comment down below and let me know. That is all for today, YouTube. If you have a story you would like me to cover, go ahead and email me. I will be pinning it to the comments and leaving it in the description of this video. Until next time, y'all do good, be good, and stay safe.